Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood on the windswept cliffs above Omaha Beach on the morning of June 4, 1944, studying the grey waters of the English Channel through his binoculars. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. Heavy clouds rolled in from the west, bringing rain and strong winds that whipped the surf into white-capped chaos. Behind him, German soldiers worked frantically to finish the last defensive obstacles, steel hedgehogs and wooden stakes embedded in the sand, mines connected to trigger wires, concrete bunkers with overlapping fields of fire. Rommel lowered his binoculars and turned to his aide. The weather forecast called for storms through at least June 10th, possibly longer. High seas, low cloud cover, conditions that would make any amphibious assault nearly suicidal. For the first time in weeks, the Desert Fox allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. This storm front might buy him the time he desperately needed. He had 72 hours, maybe 96 if the weather held badly enough. That was his window to finish transforming the Atlantic Wall from Hitler's propaganda myth into an actual barrier capable of stopping the largest invasion force in human history. Every intelligence report, every reconnaissance flight, every intercepted radio transmission told the same story. The Allies were coming. Soon. And when they arrived, the first 72 hours would determine whether German forces could drive them back into the sea or whether France would become indefensible. Rommel understood something that many in the German High Command refused to accept. There would be no second chance, no opportunity to regroup and counterattack if the initial defense failed. Allied air superiority was so complete, so overwhelming, that moving large formations in daylight had become impossible. The panzers that might reinforce the coast sat inland, hidden in forests and villages, waiting for orders that would come too late because the very act of moving them would expose them to devastating air attack. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Desert Fox had learned about Allied air power the hard way. In North Africa, he'd watched as formations that could maneuver freely at night became stationary targets by dawn. Fighter bombers would circle overhead like vultures, waiting for any vehicle to move, any dust cloud to betray a column's position. He'd seen supply convoys destroyed, fuel dumps obliterated, entire battalions pinned down by aircraft that arrived faster than anti-aircraft guns could engage them. That experience shaped Rommel's strategic assessment of the coming invasion. The battle would be won or lost on the beaches in the first 3 days. If German forces could destroy the Allied landing craft as they approached shore, machine-gun the infantry as they waded, through the surf, artillery the beachhead before engineers could establish supply dumps, then the invasion would fail. But if Allied troops secured even a narrow strip of beach, brought their own artillery ashore, established a defensive perimeter that naval guns could support, then the mathematics of attrition would favour the Allies overwhelmingly. And Rommel knew the numbers. He'd read the intelligence reports about American industrial production. Thousands of tanks per month, tens of thousands of trucks, aircraft production that exceeded the entire German output for a year. The Allies could replace losses. Germany could not. So everything depended on those first 72 hours. The window between when the first landing craft touched French soil and when Allied forces would become too strong, too numerous, too well supplied to dislodge. Rommel had been appointed commander of Army Group B in France back in November 1943. His orders were clear. Inspect the Atlantic, wall defences and prepare to repel the inevitable Allied invasion. What he found when he arrived shocked him. Hitler had proclaimed the Atlantic Wall an impregnable fortress stretching from Norway to Spain, 15,000 reinforced bunkers and pillboxes, millions of mines, countless obstacles designed to shred landing craft and trap tanks. The propaganda showed massive concrete fortifications bristling with artillery, elite troops manning perfect defences. The reality was far different. Yes, there were bunkers, impressive ones in some locations, but vast stretches of coastline had minimal defences. Many positions lacked adequate artillery. The obstacles Hitler boasted about existed primarily in propaganda films. And the troops manning these defences were not the elite divisions that had conquered France in 1940. They were a mixture of understrength coastal defence units, foreign conscripts with questionable loyalty, and garrison troops who hadn't seen combat in years. Rommel immediately demanded reinforcements, additional obstacles, more mines, stronger positions. But by late 1943, Germany's strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The Eastern Front consumed men and materials at a rate that made meaningful reinforcement of France nearly impossible. The best divisions were dying in Russia. The newest tanks were shipped east. Artillery production went to replace losses at Kursk and Karsk. What arrived in France were leftovers. Second-rate equipment, older model tanks, captured French and Czech weapons with limited ammunition supplies. So Rommel did what he'd always done. He improvised. If he couldn't get the reinforcements he wanted, he'd extract maximum defensive value from what he had. He ordered his engineers to multiply the beach obstacles. Where there had been one row of steel hedgehogs, install 3 rows. Where there were wooden stakes at the high water mark, add another line at low tide. Bury more mines, thousands more, tens of thousands more. Make the beaches so dense with obstacles that landing craft would be destroyed before they reached shore. He demanded that anti-tank ditches be dug inland from the beaches, not the token trenches that existed, but serious barriers that would channel Allied armour into killing zones. He wanted flooded fields behind Utah Beach to restrict paratrooper landing zones. He ordered the construction of thousands of Rommel's asparagus, wooden poles embedded in open fields with mines attached to their tops, designed to destroy Allied gliders that attempted to land troops behind German lines. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Field Marshal travelled constantly, inspecting positions, questioning local commanders, personally examining sight lines and defensive preparations. His staff struggled to keep up as he appeared unannounced at remote bunkers, climbed down to the beaches to test obstacle placement, studied maps late into the night planning interlocking fields of fire. He drove his subordinates relentlessly because he knew time was running out. Rommel's strategic vision clashed fundamentally with his immediate superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West. Von Rundstedt represented the old school of German military thinking. Elastic defense. Hold the coast lightly, keep powerful mobile reserves inland, allow the enemy to come ashore, then counterattack with concentrated panzer divisions once the invasion location became clear. It was classic German doctrine. Maneuver warfare, striking the enemy where he was weak, using superior tactical mobility to achieve local superiority. Rommel thought this strategy was suicide given Allied air supremacy. The panzers von Rundstedt wanted to hold in reserve would be destroyed long before they reached the battlefield. Moving armoured divisions in daylight would invite exactly the kind of air attack that had crippled German forces in North Africa. The only chance, Rommel insisted, was to position armour close enough to the coast that they could counterattack within hours of the landing, before Allied forces consolidated, before their air cover became fully effective, before naval gunfire could establish dominance over the coastal zone. The debate between Rommel and von Rundstedt never fully resolved. Hitler, characteristically, chose a compromise that satisfied neither commander. Some panzer divisions were positioned near the coast under Rommel's control. Others remained inland under von Rundstedt's command. But the most powerful armoured reserves, including the elite SS panzer divisions, were designated as strategic reserves that could only move with Hitler's personal authorization. This meant that when the invasion came, critical decisions about committing armour would have to travel up the chain of command to Hitler's headquarters, then back down. In fast-moving combat, such delays could prove catastrophic. By early June 1944, Rommel had made significant progress, but the work remained incomplete. He'd increased the number of beach obstacles from roughly 50,000 to nearly 6 million. Mine density had tripled in some sectors, but vast stretches of coastline still lacked adequate preparation. The Normandy beaches, which Rommel considered less likely invasion sites than Pas-de-Calais, remained particularly vulnerable. Not poorly defended, but not as heavily fortified as they needed to be if they became the actual target. The Field Marshal's personal assessment was grimly realistic. If the Allies landed at Pas-de-Calais, where German defences were strongest, where Rommel had concentrated his best troops and heaviest fortifications, German forces might hold, might drive the invasion back. But if they landed elsewhere, if intelligence had guessed wrong about the location, if the 40 Allies achieved surprise about where they would strike, then everything would depend on those first critical hours. Weather remained Germany's unexpected ally through early June. The forecast for June 5th and 6th showed continued storms, high winds, rough seas. Admiral Theodor Kranke, commander of German naval forces in the west, reported that the channel was too rough for invasion operations. The Luftwaffe Weather Service concurred. No landing was possible before June 10th at the earliest. This assessment led to one of the most consequential decisions of the entire campaign. Rommel requested leave to return to Germany. June 6th was his wife, Lucy's 50th birthday. He'd bought her shoes in Paris, a gift he wanted to deliver personally. More importantly, he planned to meet with Hitler on June 7th to make one final appeal for releasing the Panzer reserves to his direct control. If he could convince the Führer to position those divisions closer to the coast, German chances of defeating the invasion would improve dramatically. On June 4th, Rommel departed France for Germany. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, remained at headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. The weather looked terrible. Intelligence suggested no invasion was imminent. Senior German commanders across France relaxed their vigilance. Many officers left their posts. Training exercises were scheduled. Some units stood down from full alert status. What German meteorologists missed was a brief window of marginally acceptable weather that Allied forecasters identified. The storm system that had battered the Channel on June 4th and 5th would temporarily abate on June 6th before worsening again. Winds would decrease enough to make landing operations possible, though still difficult. Cloud cover would remain, but high enough for air operations. It was not ideal invasion weather, but it was acceptable. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, faced the most important decision of his life on the evening of June 5th. His meteorologists told him the window existed. Barely. It might close before the entire invasion force could land. The risk was enormous. But postponing meant waiting possibly 2 weeks for the next favourable tide and moon combination. 2 weeks during which the massive invasion force crammed into southern English ports might be discovered. 2 weeks during which German defences would continue improving. 2 weeks in which operational security might collapse. Eisenhower gave the order. The invasion would proceed on June 6th. More than 5,000 ships began moving toward France in the darkness. 156,000 troops prepared to assault the most heavily defended coastline in history. In France, German commanders slept. Rommel was en route to Germany. Von Rundstedt's headquarters operated with minimal staff. The Panzer divisions sat in their assembly areas, waiting for movement orders that would not come. And along the Norman coast, German soldiers manning bunkers and trenches watched the stormy Channel, convinced that no one would be foolish enough to attempt an invasion in such conditions. The first indication something was wrong came shortly after midnight on June 6th, when German radar stations detected massive formations of aircraft approaching from England. Within minutes, the scope pictures showed hundreds, then thousands of contacts. This wasn't a bombing raid. The formations were too dispersed, flying too low. Admiral Kranke's headquarters received the first reports at 0030 hours. Paratroopers were dropping across the Cotentin Peninsula behind Utah Beach and near Caen in the British sector. The reports triggered immediate alarm. Airborne drops meant invasion. But where? The paratroopers might be diversionary, designed to pull German reserves away from the actual landing beaches. Or they might be preparing the way for coastal assaults. German commanders began pulling, themselves from sleep, reaching for phones, demanding information from subordinates who had no clear picture of what was happening. General Speidel called Rommel in Germany at 06:15 hours. Allied forces were landing on the Norman coast. multiple beaches, strong naval bombardment, airborne troops inland. The invasion had begun. Rommel's response was immediate and characteristic. He would return at once. He ordered Speidel to commit all available reserves without waiting for authorization from von Rundstedt or Hitler's headquarters. Every hour of delay would make the situation worse. But Rommel was nearly 400 miles from his headquarters. Even driving at maximum speed on the excellent German Autobahn, he would not arrive until late evening. The critical first day of the invasion would unfold without him, and his orders to commit reserves immediately ran headlong into the German command structure that required authorization from higher headquarters before moving. Strategic reserves. The 21st Panzer Division represented the only significant armoured force positioned close enough to counterattack on D-Day itself. Located south of Caen, the division had approximately 127 operational tanks, including Mark IVs and captured French Sommeur tanks. Its commander, General Edgar Feuchtinger, received reports of British airborne landings just after midnight. He immediately ordered his division to prepare for combat operations and requested permission to move. Permission did not come. Von Rundstedt's headquarters was trying to assess the situation. Were these landings the main invasion or a diversion? Should the panzer reserves be committed immediately or held back until the picture became clearer? Critical hours passed while staff officers debated, and Hitler slept, having taken a sleeping pill the previous evening. His aides refused to wake him, convinced the situation could wait until morning. By 05:45, when naval pursed, bombardment began hammering German coastal defences. The situation had clarified. This was not a diversion, this was a full-scale invasion. But German command paralysis continued. The 21st Panzer Division finally received movement orders around 0800 hours, but by then Allied forces were already establishing beachheads. When the division began moving toward the coast around midday, Allied naval guns engaged them. Fighter bombers swarmed overhead. The counterattack that might have driven British forces from Sword Beach back into the Channel reached the coast around 2000 hours, far too late to prevent the beachhead from consolidating. By then, tens of thousands of British and Canadian troops had come ashore. The moment when a concentrated armoured counterattack could have succeeded had passed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mathematics of the invasion were brutally simple and became more unfavourable for Germany with each passing hour. On the morning of June 6th, approximately 156,000 Allied troops began landing across 5 beaches. By sunset, roughly 130,000 had successfully come ashore. German defenders had inflicted significant casualties, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American forces suffered approximately 2,400 casualties. But casualties alone did not stop an invasion. What mattered was whether German forces could physically push Allied troops back into the sea before they established defensible positions. German commanders watching the invasion unfold recognized immediately that the window Rommel had warned about was closing with terrifying speed. Allied troops were not just landing, they were bringing supplies ashore. Engineers were clearing beach obstacles, establishing supply dumps, marking routes inland. Artillery was being positioned. Tanks were rolling off landing craft. The infrastructure of a permanent lodgment was appearing on French soil, and German forces lacked the combat power to stop it. By the end of D-Day, the 72-hour clock Rommel had identified had begun ticking. German forces had not destroyed the invasion on the beaches. The battle now became a race. Could Germany concentrate enough force to crush the beachheads before Allied reinforcements made them impregnable? Or would Allied logistics prove faster than German reinforcement, making the lodgment too strong to dislodge? The dawn of June 7, 1944, revealed the full scope of what German commanders faced. Reconnaissance flights over the Norman coast reported a sight that defied comprehension. The English Channel was filled with ships, not dozens or even hundreds, but thousands. Transport vessels, warships, landing craft, supply ships, stretching from horizon to horizon. German pilots who'd flown combat, Missions over multiple theaters described it as the most overwhelming display of military power they'd ever witnessed. On the beaches themselves, the transformation from the previous day was startling. What had been killing zones 24 hours earlier were now organized supply areas. American engineers at Omaha Beach had cleared 16 paths through the obstacles during the night. Trucks were rolling inland, carrying ammunition, fuel, and rations. Medical stations were treating wounded. Communication lines were being established. The beachheads were no longer precarious footholds. They were becoming operational bases. Rommel reached his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon around 2200 hours on June 6th, exhausted from the long drive and furious at the situation he found. The initial reports confirmed his worst fears. Allied forces had achieved surprise regarding location and timing. German reinforcements had been delayed by command confusion and Hitler's refusal to release the panzer reserves. The critical first 12 hours, when a concentrated counterattack might have succeeded, had been wasted in hesitation and debate. The field marshal immediately began issuing orders. Every available unit was to move toward the invasion beaches at maximum speed. Artillery would displace forward to engage Allied positions. Infantry would prepare for immediate counterattacks. The panzer divisions, finally released by Hitler that afternoon, would concentrate for a major armoured assault designed to split the Allied beachheads and drive to the coast. But even as Rommel gave these orders, he understood the fundamental problem. Moving forces in daylight meant exposing them to Allied air attack. The very act of concentrating for counterattack would make German formations vulnerable, and Allied air superiority was even more complete than intelligence had predicted. German soldiers were reporting that the sky belonged entirely to the enemy. Luftwaffe aircraft were virtually absent. The few German fighters that did appear were immediately swarmed by Allied planes and driven off or shot down. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, represented one of Germany's most powerful armoured formations. Positioned northwest of Paris, the division included approximately 150 tanks and over 20,000 troops, many of them fanatical young volunteers from the Hitler Youth Organization. These were not garrison troops or second-rate coastal defenders. These were elite soldiers with modern equipment who'd trained specifically for counter-offensive operations. The division received movement orders on the afternoon of June 6th. They were to proceed to the Caen sector and prepare to counter-attack British forces that had landed at Sword and Juno beaches. Under normal circumstances, the division could have reached the assembly area within 12 to 18 hours, but circumstances were far from normal. The 12th SS began moving on the 18 size, night of June 6th. Tanks and vehicles travelled without headlights to avoid detection. Progress was slow in the darkness, over roads damaged by previous Allied bombing. At dawn, on June 7th, when the division was still more than 50 miles from the front, Allied fighter bombers found them. What followed was a systematic destruction of combat power, P-47. Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers circled overhead, attacking any vehicle that moved. German crews learned quickly that movement meant death. A tank that started its engine and pulled onto a road would be attacked within minutes. Trucks carrying infantry were incinerated by rockets. Artillery pieces being towed were targeted and destroyed. The 12th SS scattered into villages and forests, hiding their vehicles under trees and in barns, waiting for darkness to resume movement. By nightfall on June 7th, the division had covered perhaps 20 additional miles. They were still 30 miles from the front, and in that single day of Allied air attacks, they'd lost approximately 20% of their vehicles and suffered several hundred casualties without ever engaging enemy ground forces. The division that might have launched a decisive counterattack on June 7th instead spent the day hiding from aircraft, watching their combat power erode hour by hour. The Panzerlehr Division faced similar destruction. This was arguably the most powerful armoured division in the German army, equipped with Panthers and Tiger tanks, staffed with experienced crews, trained to the highest standards. Positioned southeast of Le Mans, approximately 100 miles from the invasion beaches, Panzerlehr received orders to move toward Caen on June 6th. The The division commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, understood what daylight movement would mean. He requested permission to wait until nightfall before displacing. Permission was denied. Higher headquarters insisted on immediate movement. Every hour of delay gave the Allies more time to consolidate. Bayerlein gave the orders. His division would move as quickly as possible and accept the losses. Allied aircraft were waiting. The division came under continuous air attack throughout June 7th. Fighter bombers destroyed the lead elements of the column, creating roadblocks that trapped following units. When German tanks pulled off the road to bypass destroyed vehicles, they were attacked individually. Bayerlein watched his division's combat power dissolve. By the time Panzer Lehr reached assembly areas near Caen on June 9th, they'd lost approximately 5,000 troops and significant numbers of vehicles. The division that should have arrived at full strength, ready for immediate combat operations, limped into position, depleted and exhausted. The pattern repeated across multiple divisions. Units ordered forward to counterattack the invasion suffered devastating losses during movement. German commanders faced an impossible choice: wait for darkness and waste precious time while Allied forces grew stronger, or move in daylight and lose combat power to air attacks before ever reaching the battlefield. Either choice benefited the Allies. Either choice meant German forces would be weaker when they finally did counterattack. Meanwhile, the Allied build-up continued with mechanical efficiency. By the end of June 7th, approximately 226,000 troops had landed in Normandy. This included 146,000 across the 5 invasion beaches and approximately 80,000 airborne troops. The logistical operation supporting this force was unprecedented in military history. More supplies were crossing Norman beaches every day than typically moved through major peacetime ports. American ingenuity had solved problems German planners assumed would be insurmountable. The Allies didn't need to capture ports immediately because they'd brought their own. The Mulberry artificial harbours were being assembled offshore. These massive structures consisted of floating breakwaters made from sunken ships and concrete caissons, creating protected waters where landing craft and small vessels could operate safely. Floating roadways extended from these breakwaters to the shore, allowing vehicles to drive directly from ships to land. At Utah Beach, engineers completed the Mulberry installation by June 9th. The harbour could handle the unloading capacity equivalent to a major commercial port. Similar construction proceeded at Omaha Beach. What should have required months to accomplish through capturing and repairing French ports was being achieved in days through prefabricated engineering solutions. German commanders who'd assumed that Allied logistics would falter without access to established ports watched in dismay as supplies poured across open beaches at rates they'd believed impossible. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, everything, a modern, mechanized army. Required was arriving daily and being distributed to forward units with remarkable efficiency. Rommel spent June 7th touring the front lines, assessing German positions, encouraging defenders, and trying to organize effective counterattacks despite the impossible circumstances. What he saw confirmed his pre-invasion predictions. Allied air superiority had made conventional mobile warfare obsolete. German troops could defend from prepared positions, but any attempt to maneuver in the open invited immediate destruction from above. At one point during his inspection, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighter bombers. The vehicle swerved off the road and crashed into a ditch. Rommel and his aides survived, but the incident reinforced what every German soldier in Normandy was learning. The sky belonged to the enemy. Movement was dangerous. Concentration was suicidal. The tactical flexibility that had made the Wehrmacht so effective in Poland, France, and Russia had been negated by overwhelming Allied air power. The British and Canadian sectors around Caen became the focus of major German counterattacks during June 7th and 8th. The 21st Panzer Division, having finally reached the coast on the evening of June 6th, launched renewed assaults against British positions on June 7th. These attacks achieved local tactical successes, pushing British forces back in some areas, but failed to break through to the beaches or split the Allied lodgement. The fundamental problem was one of arithmetic. German forces were attempting to counterattack against positions that were growing stronger by the hour. British troops that had numbered in the tens of thousands on June 6th had swelled to over 80,000 by June 7th. They'd brought tanks ashore, established artillery positions, and created defensive lines that Allied naval guns could support. German infantry attacking these positions faced not just British rifles and machine guns, but naval bombardment from destroyers and cruisers lying offshore. HMS Warspite, a veteran battleship that had fought at Jutland in World War I, demonstrated the devastating effect of naval gunfire support. When German forces attempted to advance towards Sword Beach on June 8th, Warspite engaged them with her 15-inch main armament. Each shell weighed nearly 1 ton. The psychological and physical impact of such bombardment on attacking infantry was catastrophic. German survivors described the experience as being helpless before an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't fight back against. The window Rommel had identified, the 72 hours when German counterattacks might drive the Allies back into the Channel, was closing faster than even the pessimistic Field Marshal had predicted. By the morning of June 8th, 48 hours after the initial landings, Allied forces in Normandy numbered over 326,000 troops. They controlled a continuous lodgement, approximately 50 miles wide and 10 miles deep. They'd linked up all 5 beachheads into a single defensive perimeter. They'd established supply dumps, ammunition points, fuel depots, medical facilities, communication networks, and command posts. They'd brought nearly 60,000 vehicles ashore, including tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and engineering equipment. German forces attempting to contain this lodgement were outnumbered, under-equipped, and unable to maneuver freely. The elite panzer divisions that might have made a difference were still struggling to reach the battlefield through Allied air attacks. The coastal defence divisions that had borne the initial assault were shattered, many at less than 50% strength. Reinforcements were arriving, but too slowly and too depleted to restore German numerical advantage. Rommel filed his first comprehensive assessment to von Rundstedt's headquarters on June 8th. His report was bluntly realistic. The situation was developing unfavourably. Allied material superiority, especially in artillery and air power, was decisive. German forces were fighting well from defensive positions, but counterattacks were proving impossible to execute effectively. Every attempt to concentrate forces for offensive operations exposed those forces to devastating air attack. German casualties were mounting rapidly, while Allied reinforcements continued pouring ashore. The Field Marshal's most critical observation addressed the fundamental strategic question: could German forces still drive the Allies back into the sea? Rommel's assessment was that the opportunity had passed. The beachheads were too strong, too well supplied, too heavily reinforced. German forces might contain the Allied advance for a time, might even conduct successful local counterattacks, but lacked the combat power to physically push Allied armies back across the Channel. This conclusion, reached just 48 hours after the invasion began, represented the collapse of Germany's entire defensive strategy for the West. Everything had depended on defeating the invasion on the beaches in the first critical hours. That failure meant France would become a battlefield of attrition, exactly the kind of grinding campaign Germany could not afford to fight against enemies with vastly superior industrial capacity. By June 9th, 72 hours after the first Allied soldier stepped onto French soil, the statistics told an irrefutable story. Allied forces in Normandy exceeded 400,000 troops. They'd landed over 100,000 vehicles. They controlled over 500 square miles of French territory. They'd established 6 functioning airfields within the lodgement where Allied fighters and bombers could land, rearm, refuel, and return to combat without flying back to England. The infrastructure of a permanent military presence had been created. German forces facing this lodgement numbered approximately 150,000 troops, many in depleted or under-strength units. German reinforcements continued arriving, but at a fraction of the rate Allied forces were building up. And those reinforcements arrived exhausted from Allied air harassment, having suffered significant casualties before ever reaching the front lines. The Panzer Lehr Division, Germany's premier armoured formation, had finally reached assembly areas near Caen by June 9th. But the division that should have numbered 23,000 troops and 190 tanks arrived with perhaps 18,000 effectives and 150 operational tanks. 5,000 casualties and 40 destroyed or damaged tanks were the price of simply reaching the battlefield, and this was considered an elite formation that had performed better than most units during the approach march. Rommel met with several divisional commanders on June 9th to assess possibilities for continued counterattacks. The discussions revealed the extent of German disadvantages. Divisional commanders reported that moving battalion-sized formations in daylight resulted in casualties of 20 to 30% before those units even engaged Allied ground forces. Artillery displacement to new firing positions required night movement because Allied counter-battery fire was devastatingly accurate. Air support from the Luftwaffe was essentially non-existent. Some divisions reported not seeing a single German aircraft overhead in 3 days of combat. The ammunition situation was becoming critical. German artillery was rationing shells because supply convoys were being destroyed by Allied aircraft before reaching the front. Some batteries were limited to 10 shells per gun per day. In contrast, Allied artillery fired hundreds of shells per gun daily. German soldiers could hear the constant thunder of Allied guns, knowing that their own forces could not match that volume of fire. Fuel shortages were developing. German tanks consumed enormous quantities of gasoline. The Panthers and Tigers were mechanically complex, required frequent maintenance, and had limited operational range before needing refueling. Supply of fuel to forward units meant running truck convoys through Allied air attacks. Many convoys never arrived. Tanks immobilized for lack of fuel were being destroyed in place or abandoned. The cumulative effect of these shortages meant that even when German commanders had troops and equipment available, they lacked the logistical support to sustain offensive operations. A counterattack might begin with adequate forces, but would run out of ammunition or fuel within hours. Allied forces facing these attacks could call on seemingly unlimited supplies of artillery shells, could request airstrikes within minutes, could bring forward replacement tanks and troops from reserves that appeared inexhaustible. On the evening of June 9th, Rommel composed a letter to his wife Lucy. The letter was personal, not an official report, and his words revealed the Field Marshal's recognition that the battle was already lost. He wrote that the enemy's command of the air limits all movement. Everything has to be brought up at night with tremendous casualties. He described the situation as very grave, and noted that the enemy is bringing up new forces and materials continually. The letter never mentioned the 72-hour window explicitly, but Rommel understood that those critical 3 days had determined the campaign's outcome. June 6th through June 9th had been the period when German forces might have driven the Allies back. That opportunity had passed. France was now indefensible in the strategic sense. German forces could still fight, could make the Allies pay for every mile of advance, but could not prevent the ultimate Allied breakout and liberation of France. Allied commanders, reaching similar conclusions from the opposite perspective, recognized that the lodgment had achieved critical mass. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British and Canadian forces, assessed on June 9th that the beachhead was secure. German counterattacks had been contained. Reinforcement rates favoured the Allies by enormous margins. Barring some catastrophic reversal, the invasion had succeeded. Now the campaign became a matter of breaking out from Normandy and exploiting into France. General Omar Bradley, commanding American forces, shared Montgomery's assessment. The desperate fighting at Omaha Beach on June 6th had given way to steady expansion inland. American forces were pushing toward Carenton, linking Utah and Omaha beaches into a continuous front. They were establishing positions from which to launch the eventual breakout toward Brittany and Paris. The critical, vulnerable period had passed. The statistics after 72 hours were overwhelming. Allied forces had landed over 450,000 troops, over 100,000 tons of supplies, and nearly 80,000 vehicles. German forces had destroyed or damaged perhaps 5% of that total. The remaining 95% constituted an invasion force larger than anything ever assembled in military history, now firmly established on French soil with logistics supporting continued indefinite growth. Rommel's assessment that Germany had 72 hours to defeat the invasion had proven grimly accurate. Those 72 hours had passed with the Allies growing stronger each day and German counterattacks failing to achieve decisive results. The Field Marshal's pre-invasion prediction that the battle would be won or lost on the beaches in the first days had been validated by events. Germany had lost that battle. The rest was inevitable consequence. By June 10th, 192 hours after the first Allied troops landed, the transformation was complete. The invasion beachheads had become operational bases. The beaches that had been covered with obstacles and defended by bunkers on June 5th were now organized supply areas with roads, fuel dumps, ammunition depots, and medical facilities. Engineers had cleared millions of mines. Construction battalions had built temporary harbors. Signal units had established communication networks connecting every Allied division with headquarters in England. Allied air superiority had become absolute domination. German soldiers reported that seeing a Luftwaffe aircraft had become so rare that troops would stop fighting momentarily to watch the unusual sight. In contrast, Allied aircraft appeared to be everywhere simultaneously. Fighter bombers circled German positions constantly, attacking any target that revealed itself. Heavy bombers struck German supply centres and rail junctions deep in France. Transport aircraft dropped supplies to Allied forces and evacuated wounded back to England. The naval dimension remained decisive throughout this critical period. German attempts to interject with naval forces failed completely. The Kriegsmarine had virtually no surface units capable of challenging Allied control of the Channel. E-boats, small, fast attack craft, attempted raids against the invasion fleet but accomplished little. German submarines tried to reach the invasion area but found the approaches so heavily patrolled that successful attacks were nearly impossible. Allied destroyers and corvettes maintained anti-submarine screens that made the Channel effectively impassable to German U-boats. Meanwhile, Allied warships provided continuous fire support to ground forces. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers engaged German positions miles inland. Their accuracy was remarkable, directed by forward observers with radio communications. German commanders planning counterattacks had to factor in not just Allied ground forces and air power, but naval guns that could drop hundreds of pounds of high explosives on any concentration of German troops. The 72 hours that determined France's fate revealed the catastrophic consequences of German strategic errors that predated the invasion by months and years. The failure to achieve air superiority over France meant German forces fought without the reconnaissance, close air support, and logistics protection that modern mechanized warfare required. The divided command structure between Rommel and von Rundstedt, with Hitler maintaining personal control over strategic reserves, had paralyzed German response during the critical first hours. The obsessive focus on Pas-de-Calais as the invasion site, reinforced by Allied deception operations, had positioned Germany's strongest forces hundreds of miles from where they were needed. Rommel had recognized these problems. His desperate efforts in the months before D-Day to strengthen beach defenses, position armor closer to the coast, and streamline the command structure represented attempts to overcome fundamental German disadvantages. But time ran out before he could complete these preparations. The invasion came when German defences were strong enough to inflict casualties, but not strong enough to prevent a lodgment. The Field Marshal's prediction about the 72-hour window proved accurate not just operationally, but strategically. Those 3 days between June 6th and June 9th determined not just whether the Allies would remain in France, but whether Germany could continue fighting the war in the West on anything like equal terms. Once Allied forces established themselves in strength, once their logistics created self-sustaining supply chains, once their reinforcement rates exceeded German capabilities to match them, the strategic balance shifted irreversibly. German forces would continue fighting in Normandy for another 2 months. The bocage country of hedgerows and sunken lanes favoured defenders. German soldiers fought with skill and determination. Local counterattacks achieved tactical successes, but the overall trajectory was Préblice's, inevitable from June 9th onward. Allied forces would gradually expand the lodgment, accumulate overwhelming material superiority, break out from Normandy, and sweep across France toward Germany. Rommel understood this. His letters and reports from mid-June onward reflected not optimism about eventual victory, but determination to make the Allies pay the highest possible price for their advance. The Desert Fox, who'd once dreamed of driving the British back across the Mediterranean, now focused on the more limited goal of delaying American and British armies long enough for Germany to develop some war-winning technology or negotiate some acceptable peace. Neither possibility materialized. Germany had no wonder weapons capable of offsetting Allied material superiority, and the Allies had agreed on unconditional surrender as their war aim. There would be no negotiated peace that left any Nazi regime in power. The 72 hours that Rommel had identified as critical had determined that France would not remain German. The months that followed determined how quickly and at what cost France would be liberated. The final irony was that Rommel's strategic assessment had been entirely correct. His warnings about Allied air superiority making mobile warfare impossible proved accurate. His insistence that the invasion must be defeated on the beaches was validated. His prediction that German forces would have only 72 hours to decide the issue was confirmed by events. But being right about the problem didn't provide solutions when Germany lacked the resources and command structure to implement them. By late June, the Normandy lodgment contained over 850,000 Allied troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and 150,000 vehicles. German forces facing them were increasingly composed of replacement units, rushed forward to fill gaps in the line, under-strength divisions amalgamated to create effective formations, and the remnants of elite units that had been ground down through constant combat. The mathematical imbalance was staggering and growing worse daily. Allied casualties in Normandy through June were significant. Approximately 62,000 Americans, 24,000 British and Canadian troops killed, wounded, or missing. These were heavy losses by any standard. But Allied logistics could replace them. Replacement divisions were training in England and the United States. Equipment losses were being made good from production that exceeded consumption despite the heavy combat. The Allied war machine possessed depth that allowed absorption of casualties that would have crippled a smaller force. German casualties through June exceeded 115,000, killed, wounded, and missing. These losses came from a force that began the campaign smaller than Allied strength and lacked replacement capacity to restore units to full effectiveness. Divisions reduced to 50%, strength remained in the line because no replacements were available. Equipment losses could not be replaced. Tanks destroyed in combat stayed destroyed. Artillery pieces lost to Allied counter-battery fire were not replaced. The Wehrmacht in Normandy was being consumed faster than Germany could regenerate it. The strategic implications extended beyond Normandy. Every division committed to fighting in France was unavailable for the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were preparing massive summer offensives. Germany was fighting a true two-front war with insufficient resources for either theatre. The 72 hours in Normandy that determined France's fate indirectly influenced the war in the East by fixing German forces in place at precisely the moment they were desperately needed elsewhere. Rommel spent July trying to stabilize a deteriorating situation. He positioned forces to contain the expanding Allied lodgment. He organized the defense of Caen, which British forces were attempting to capture. He coordinated with von Rundstedt on how to slow the inevitable Allied breakout. But the Field Marshal's reports to higher headquarters became increasingly blunt. Germany could not win in Normandy. The best outcome would be conducting a fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions while negotiating some end to the war before total collapse. These reports did not please Hitler. The Führer demanded victory, or at least preventing defeat. He rejected any suggestion of withdrawal or negotiation. German forces would hold every metre of ground. They would counterattack and drive the Allies back. Reality would conform to his will because he commanded it to do so. On July 17th, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighter bombers near Liverot. The attack left the Field Marshal with severe head injuries, including a fractured skull. He was evacuated to Germany for treatment, ending his active participation in the Normandy campaign. The man who'd understood, better than most German commanders, what the invasion would require to defeat, had been removed from command by the very air superiority he'd warned about. The Battle of Normandy continued through August. American forces finally broke out from the lodgment at the end of July during Operation Cobra. British and Canadian forces pinned German divisions around Caen, while American armour poured through the gap at Saint-Lô. What followed was the collapse Rommel had predicted. German forces in Normandy were encircled at Falaise. Thousands surrendered. Tens of thousands died. The remainder fled eastward toward the German border in disorder. Paris was liberated on August 25th. Allied forces reached the German frontier by early September. The campaign that began with 156,000 Allied troops landing across 5 beaches in Normandy ended with millions of Allied soldiers advancing across a broad front toward Germany itself. The 72 hours in early June, when Germany might have driven those first 156,000 back into the Channel, had determined the outcome of the entire campaign. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recovering from his injuries in Germany, was implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. Whether he actually participated remains historically uncertain. What is certain is that on October 14, 1944, SS officers arrived at his home with a choice: stand trial for treason with certainty of execution and punishment for his family, or commit suicide and receive a hero's funeral with protection for his wife and son. Rommel chose suicide. The man who'd recognized that Germany had 72 hours to save France died at age 52, destroyed by the regime he'd served. The invasion he'd tried to defeat and then tried to fight to a stalemate had succeeded beyond Allied expectations. The 72-hour window he'd identified as critical had proven exactly that. Those 3 days from June 6th through June 9th, 1944, determined that France would be liberated, that Germany would fight the war's final year defending its own territory, and that Allied victory was mathematically inevitable, barring some unprecedented reversal. When German officers stood on the cliffs above Omaha Beach on June 4th watching storm clouds gather over the Channel, they'd believed weather might provide the time needed to finish defensive preparations. When Rommel departed for Germany on June 5th to celebrate his wife's birthday, he believed the invasion was not imminent. When Hitler went to sleep on the night of June 5th after taking a sleeping pill, he believed his Atlantic Wall would hold. All these beliefs were proven wrong within 72 hours. The window closed. The opportunity passed. France became indefensible not through any single catastrophic defeat, but through the accumulation of Allied advantages during those critical first 3 days. By the time German commanders fully grasped the scale of what they faced, 156,000 Allied troops had become 400,000, beachheads had become operational bases, and the invasion had achieved the critical mass that made its success inevitable. Rommel had been right. Germany had 72 hours. Those hours passed, and with them passed any German hope of maintaining control over France. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.